Perhaps you believe that when a public figure addresses you directly, it is merely a rhetorical device, a calculated strategy to create a false sense of intimacy. Perhaps you assume that in the noise of public discourse, a message aimed at everyone is ultimately a message for no one. You may have never considered that certain truths are fragile, that their meaning is distorted by the crowd and can only be apprehended by an individual mind at a precise moment of reflection. This conversation is for that mind. It is for you. I wish to convey something I have not articulated in this manner before, an idea that can only be offered to you directly. To broadcast it would be to dilute its substance, to destroy its utility for the specific person who requires it now. This is not about market forecasts or the public affairs of my foundations. This is about a far more critical and immediate juncture. A recognition that you are facing a choice at this exact moment that will define the intellectual integrity of the person you become and, consequently, your capacity to influence the world. I am sharing this today because I believe you are the person who needs to receive it, not because of a demographic you belong to, but because the specific formation of your circumstances has led you to this point, a point where a single insight could alter the trajectory of your entire life. The message is this: you are on the verge of abandoning a conviction that is more critical than you currently perceive. To retreat now would be the most profound mistake of your life. I know this because I recognize the symptoms of a mind under duress. You have been pursuing a truth, not necessarily a financial target, but a deeper thesis about the way a system works or fails to work. It represents a principle you wish to live by, but you have been met with overwhelming obstacles, flawed outcomes that seem to invalidate your reasoning, and the entrenched criticism or indifference of those whose intellectual support you expected. You have begun to question if your thesis was sound, if you possess the intellectual rigor to see it through, if the effort is worth the cost in energy and focus. Dangerously, you have begun to rationalize this retreat, telling yourself that your original aspirations were intellectually arrogant, and that adapting to a more conventional view is pragmatism rather than a failure of nerve. You are mistaken, and it is imperative you understand why before you make a decision you will regret for the remainder of your life. The conviction you are considering abandoning is not merely a project or a goal. It is the very part of your intellect that challenges prevailing orthodoxies, that refuses to accept the flawed premises others take for granted, that perceives fragilities where others see only immutable strength. If you surrender this now, you are not merely changing course. You are extinguishing the most valuable part of your character, the faculty that allows you to make contributions that no one else can. I have been where you are now. There have been moments when to continue seemed not merely difficult, but irrational. The most vivid of these was not in building an organization, but in testing a conviction against the full force of a state and the consensus of the global market. In 1992, my fund had taken a massive position against the British pound. My thesis was that the pound was artificially overvalued within the European exchange rate mechanism and that the Bank of England could not sustain its position. It was a contrarian view, a direct challenge to the authority of a sovereign government. Every rational advisor warned of the immense risk, that the logical choice was to cut our losses and defer to the power of a central bank. The establishment, political, financial, and intellectual, was united against this position. But something within me refused to accept that logic, not from a place of certainty, but because I understood that the thesis itself was more important than my personal financial security. I realized that if I abandoned the position because I was intimidated by the consensus, rather than because my analysis was proven wrong, I would never forgive myself. I would always wonder what might have been possible had I possessed the courage to follow my reasoning to its conclusion. More importantly, I understood that the person I would become by retreating would be fundamentally different from the person I would become by holding fast to a conviction I believed to be true, regardless of the outcome. The choice wasn't truly between profit and loss. It was between becoming someone who surrendered his intellectual framework when challenged by an overwhelming authority, or someone who maintained his principles even when doing so invited catastrophic risk. That realization changed my perception of the obstacles. They were not evidence that my thesis was flawed. They were the price of challenging a powerful and entrenched orthodoxy. The resistance is what proves the idea matters. This is what you must understand about your current situation. The difficulties you are experiencing are not signs you should give up. They are signs that you are working on a problem important enough to be difficult. Consensual ideas do not reshape our understanding of the world. Comfortable challenges do not forge the kind of intellectual character that enables extraordinary contributions. The resistance you are facing is not arbitrary. It is the inevitable reaction of a system defending its own flawed premises. Most people retreat at the precise moment their persistence would have made the difference between conventional failure and a historic breakthrough. They interpret resistance as evidence of impossibility rather than as proof of significance. You have the opportunity to be different. You can choose to see your current challenges as the cost of attempting something vital, rather than as a reason to abandon your convictions. The specific idea you are considering giving up on is not just one of many alternatives. It is the manifestation of your belief that you can perceive the world with clarity, that your efforts can challenge falsehood, and that our world can be improved through intellectual courage and persistence. If you abandon this belief now, you will have taught yourself that when a system pushes back, retreat is the reasonable response. But if you persist, you will prove to yourself that you are capable of continuing when continuation seems irrational. You will develop the kind of resilience that makes future challenges more manageable, not more intimidating. This is not a matter of blind conviction, of refusing to acknowledge reality. It is about understanding the crucial difference between a flawed hypothesis that requires refinement and a core conviction that requires you to withstand a siege. Most of the barriers you face are not immutable laws. They are the artifacts of a flawed consensus, and they are vulnerable to a creative and persistent mind. The question is not whether a solution exists, but whether you will continue to search for it when the intellectual effort becomes uncomfortable or the outcome uncertain. I tell you this because I perceive something in your situation that you may not. You are closer to validating your thesis than you realize. The intellectual capital you have accumulated, the nuanced understanding you have gained through missteps and observation, is an investment that will be lost if you retreat now. But it will compound exponentially if you continue. The next several months will determine whether you become someone who perseveres through a profound intellectual challenge, or someone who retreats when the pressure to conform becomes too great. This choice will define your approach to every future problem that requires sustained intellectual courage. The people who trust your judgment are counting on you to prove that the faith they have invested in your potential was justified. But more importantly, the part of your own mind that first perceived the anomaly, the flaw in the system, deserves the chance to see what you are capable of when you refuse to concede to a flawed reality. Let me describe the specific moment when I nearly abandoned a core conviction, because I believe you are in a similar place. You must understand what that moment taught me about the difference between a temporary setback and a permanent failure of nerve. The year was 1992, during the tense days of September. I was in my office late at night, surrounded not by machinery, but by the abstract glow of data on screens. My fund had staked its existence on a single momentous thesis: that the British pound was fundamentally overvalued and the Bank of England's efforts to prop it up would fail. We were hemorrhaging money daily to maintain the position. The financial press portrayed me as a reckless speculator, and the entire weight of the British government and the European consensus was arrayed against us, insisting the system was sound. The worst part was not the financial pressure. It was the insidious voice of my own fallibility. The voice that whispered, maybe they were right. Maybe you have become intellectually arrogant. Maybe the smart thing to do is to admit the system is stronger than your theory and unwind the position before you are ruined. I had reached the point I believe you are at now. The point where continuing feels like a stubborn denial of an obvious reality, where the established authorities seem wiser and more pragmatic, where your contrarian insight begins to feel naive and foolish. That night, I picked up the phone to call my head trader. The words were on my lips to give the order. Let's start unwinding. Cut the losses. It was the sensible thing to do, the act of a prudent manager mitigating a catastrophic loss. But before I spoke, I paused. I thought of my mentor, Karl Popper, and his writings on the fallibility of closed, dogmatic systems. I reflected on my own theory of reflexivity, the idea that market participants' biases can change the very fundamentals they believe they are only observing. The British government was not acting on economic reality, it was acting on a perception of political necessity. Its belief was creating a false reality, and such realities are inherently fragile. What had changed was not the flaw in the system, that remained. What had changed was my nerve. I had allowed the sheer force of the consensus and the authority of the state to make me doubt my own analysis. As I sat there, I realized that giving up was not about accepting practical limitations. It was about choosing who I wanted to be. Was I a man who abandoned his deepest intellectual convictions when they were inconvenient and dangerous? Or was I a man who acted on what he understood to be true, regardless of the consequences? I put down the phone. I did not give the order to retreat. Instead, after a moment of intense reflection, I called my trader back and gave a different instruction. Increase the position, substantially. It was a decision to bet everything, not on an outcome, but on a principle. That reality will, in the end, assert itself over perception. Days later, on what became known as Black Wednesday, the Bank of England capitulated. The pound crashed. Our thesis was validated on a global scale. But the real victory wasn't the profit. It was the knowledge that I had persisted through the kind of intellectual doubt that crushes most people. It was the validation of an entire framework for understanding the world. This is what I need you to understand. You are in your September D992 moment. You are facing the choice between the person you become by conceding to the consensus and the person you become by holding fast to your own analysis. The voice telling you to be realistic is not wisdom. It is fear disguised as pragmatism. The people suggesting you lower your expectations are not necessarily wrong about the difficulties, but they are wrong about what those difficulties signify. Difficulty is not evidence of impossibility. In this case, it is evidence that you are challenging a deeply entrenched and powerful falsehood. Easy problems of perception have already been solved by others. The hard problems, the ones that require you to stand against the crowd, are where you have the opportunity to make a contribution no one else can. You are likely surrounded by people who point to your setbacks as evidence you should adjust your expectations. But those people operate within the prevailing paradigm. They cannot see its flaws as you can. Here is the final part of the text, adapted for the persona of George Soros. These people have never operated outside of an established framework. They do not understand that historic shifts in perception always appear impossible until, suddenly, they become irreversible. They mistake the powerful resistance that precedes any significant paradigm shift for evidence that the shift is impossible. The truth is that you are likely much closer to the validation of your thesis than anyone around you, including yourself, can perceive. The intellectual capital you've developed, the nuanced understanding of the system you have acquired through your errors, these are assets that compound. Most people abandon their position just before the market's perception violently snaps into alignment with the underlying reality they foresaw. They interpret the long period of building a position without obvious results as evidence that their thesis is flawed, when it is actually evidence that they are approaching the breaking point, where the returns become exponential, not linear. Therefore, I propose a course of action. For a finite period, let us say the next 30 days, commit to operating as if your core conviction is correct and the market is simply wrong. Do not focus on the ultimate outcome. Focus on executing your strategy based on your thesis. Use all your intellectual energy not to question if you are right, but to analyze how events will unfold according to your framework. During this period of intense discipline, you will find that many of the obstacles that seemed insurmountable become manageable variables. Most importantly, you will reconnect with the clarity of your original analysis, the insight that motivated you before the noise of the consensus began to erode your confidence. After this period of committed effort, you will be in a superior position to evaluate the situation based on evidence, not on fear or the opinions of those who cannot comprehend what you are attempting. But I believe if you grant yourself this interval of pure intellectual commitment, you will no longer wish to retreat. You will have rediscovered the profound satisfaction that comes from acting on a difficult truth and rebuilt the conviction that market volatility had shaken. The message I have for you is this: your capacity for perception is greater than you currently believe. The thesis you are pursuing matters more than current events suggest, and abandoning it now would be to deprive the world of a correction that only you have had the vision to orchestrate. Do not allow temporary volatility to convince you to abandon a permanent insight. Do not let the opinions of those who have never challenged a prevailing orthodoxy influence your commitment to a truth that represents your deepest analysis. You began this because you believed it was important. That belief was correct. The only thing that has changed is that you have now encountered the fierce resistance that always confronts a disruptive truth. Maintain your discipline. Trust your analysis. Give yourself the chance to discover what becomes possible when you refuse to concede to a flawed consensus. The world needs the correction you are working on, even if it does not yet recognize that need. But more than that, you need to see this through to become the person you are capable of being. Do not give up. Not now. Every person who has ever forced a shift in thinking has faced a moment precisely like the one you face now. A moment when persistence seemed irrational, when the evidence suggested retreat, when the consensus counseled acceptance of limitations, they refused to accept. But here is the critical insight that goes beyond inspirational rhetoric. The moment when giving up seems most reasonable is, in fact, the moment you are closest to a breakthrough. This is not a mystical principle. It is because that is the point of maximum stress on a flawed system. You have eliminated most of the variables that do not work. You are applying direct pressure to the weakest point. Every setback has given you essential data. Every failed prediction has eliminated a false pathway. Every person who has told you to lower your expectations has revealed the exact contours of the dogmatic belief you are challenging. The system's internal contradictions are at their peak. You are closer than you think. Press your advantage.